Okay, classical conditioning part two. Oh my gosh, there's more. Miss Myers, please stop talking about this. No, this is actually the interesting things, I think, because now we're going to talk about humans and some more advanced areas of classical conditioning and things that might relate a little bit more to you because they are talking about not just basic things like training a dog for food. All right, so let's talk about something called learned helplessness first. This is really interesting. It's a cognitive process, meaning that your thinking is associated with learned helplessness. So learned helplessness, the classic example of this is that there's a dog in a box, and it's learned that, or it's a learned behavior that every time it goes across a line, it gets shocked. All right, so if I go across a certain like red line, that I randomly get a shock, or it's like given a small shock. But after some time, so the dog never feels like he can do right, that he can't go anywhere. Learned helplessness is where that dog will just end up sitting there over and over and over, and maybe even be shocked there because he's just learned that there's nothing that's going to get a positive reaction. This is actually kind of associated with like depression in a dog, that they will just stay in one spot because they don't feel like they can do anything right. We sometimes associate this with people, that they've tried different things before to get help or to try math a couple times, and they've just had these really bad experiences. So they think it's better just to sit and do nothing even if bad things happen, because they've learned that doing anything else is not going to work for them. So that's learned helplessness, meaning that they've learned that the lights are going off, that they cannot do any right, so they just stay in the same spot. I know it's time to go home when the lights turn off. All right, so that's learned helplessness. Biological predispositions, conditions, taste aversions. So there's some animals, so kind of going back to Charles Darwin and survival of the fittest. There are some animals that learn not to, I don't know, eat a monarch butterfly because it tastes bitter. So birds will not eat monarch butterflies because there's a very bitter taste to it, and they end up just spitting it out. So in general, they don't eat them, and some even animals kind of mooch off of that. So there's some butterflies that look like a monarch but aren't. So they're not that poisonous bitter taste, but birds still don't eat them. So there's a conditioned taste aversion, meaning that the bird tasted it once, it didn't taste good, so they don't eat it again. Interesting things done with rats. So a rat was given like some lemon juice or something that tasted, or like some something that was like yellow, and then put through radiation treatment. So something bad happened afterwards, and usually people feel nauseous after that. So the rat in the future avoided eating the lemon juice because they thought that that's what caused their nauseousness, right? This actually got rid of this kind of idea that there needs to be a response right after the stimulus. So the dog needs to see or hear the bell and then be given the food immediately in order to condition a response. So the scientists discovered that's not true, that a rat can eat something 5 hours ago, feel sick later, and then learn to avoid that food. Right? So that's another conditioned response, is like, I won't eat potatoes because one time I got sick. I'm not quite sure if it was the potatoes or what made me feel nauseous or something else, but it doesn't have to happen immediately after for someone to learn or have a learned behavior because of a bad response. Now, I keep talking about these negative things, but you can actually opposite. Like, you can train it to be a good thing. Maybe you taste something, it's really good, or something later happens that's amazing. Maybe you start to associate those two things. Or some people get really superstitious almost about sports, like, I have to eat a half of banana and a Cliff Bar with a little bit of peanut butter because one time during a race that I did really good. So I start to associate like what I ate with how I'm going to perform. So here's another example of extended Pavlov's understanding. Okay, so I have my unconditioned response, which is going to be, sorry, let me go to the slide. Unconditioned stimulus is going to be my drug, right? So the thing that's going to make a response, unconditioned stimulus. My unconditioned response right now is nausea. So that drug caused me to be nauseous or feel sick to my stomach. So before conditioning, these are my unconditioned stimulus and response. So after conditioning, now I'm waiting in the waiting room to get a drug that I know is going to make me nauseous. Right? So I always have to wait in the waiting room for 10 minutes in the same room. I get a drug, it makes me nauseous. After conditioning, just waiting in the waiting room makes me feel sick because I know what's going to happen. Right? You can see how this is kind of gets to be a self-fulfilling prophecy too, right? That like just knowing you're going to take it makes you feel sick before you've even taken the drug. Now, there's a couple reasons why that could be. So going back to learning, we're going to go back to our three model of what influences learning. So we've talked about this biopsychosocial influences for a couple different things. So in my center here, we're focusing on learning. So what could have an influence on the way something is trained almost to be conditioned responses? First of all, biology. So biology, I could have a genetic predisposition, pro or con, right, to being influenced on learning. That could influence my unconditioned responses. So things like feeling sick, salivating, that would be my biology. I give up on keeping the lights on, by the way, so you can just look at me in the dark. And then adaptive responses. So those are all biology influences, things that come from you, your body. All right. My psychological influences, the way I'm thinking, previous experience, if I've seen someone go through something, even though I haven't, predicting associations. So like I just said, I know I'm going to do bad on something, or I feel sick even though I'm psyching myself into thinking that something bad is going to happen. Generalizations, that's what I talked about with the teachers, that you take one thing and you generalize. It might not be all teachers in general. Maybe you had one teacher who had like long curly brown hair or something like that, and every time you see a teacher has long curly brown hair, you generalize them in with that other person. It's kind of like stereotyping, right? And then discrimination, meaning that once you're able to really tone out the things that are different. So it's not every bell that you hear or all teachers, it's like just one particular teacher. That would be my psychological influences on learning. And then social cultural, always. How you're perceived by the surroundings, right? So if you're watching all these people being trained to do something, you're more likely to kind of follow the social norm to do it. So culturally learned preferences. Things might not be normal, or people might like make fun of doing something, so you learn not to do that thing. That's your learned, is that I want to fit in, so I won't do that with like my friends. And motivation. So absolutely having other people there motivating you or unmotivating you is a huge influence on learning. You're just being in the presence of others. So Pavlov's legacy, what have we done since his dog experiments? We've learned that classical conditioning applies to other organisms, including humans. So we'll look at that in class. How are you able to classically condition your partner? And then showed how to study a topic scientifically. How can I take something like learning and make it and put it into a scientific experiment, which he was able to. He's able to measure the drops of saliva to very scientifically introduce responses. And then we're going to talk about poor baby Albert. So other application of classical conditioning, we'll talk about Watson in class, but baby Albert, we'll watch his video. Baby Albert was this poor little baby that every time he was shown a bunny rabbit, someone clapped very loudly behind him. So he learned to associate a bunny rabbit to being scared and crying, forever afraid of bunnies. So that's kind of where some of our thoughts on learned fears come from, that maybe when you were little, sometimes you saw a spider and something scary happened, so now you always associate spiders with scary. All right, so those are our classical conditioning notes ending. Tomorrow night we'll talk about operant conditioning, which is different from classical, but we'll talk about that tomorrow and Watson, and then we'll watch poor baby Albert be